One thing I've been watching is the Biden administration has come out with more stimulus checks in an effort to help people better manage their energy bills going into the winter. And for those who understand economics, you realize that this is just going to exacerbate the problem, because the way that you fix inflation is you decrease demand and increase supply, and they're doing the opposite. They're giving out these stimulus checks, they're increasing aggregate demand, and then they're reducing supply through the sanctions against Russia, and with all this narrative towards a windfall profit tax, and it's creating huge issues that we see pop up in the diesel market. The inventories there are close to an all-time low. 25 days of inventory is all we have left. These are big, big problems. But my point going into the midterms is I think what they're going to do is they're just going to try to buy votes any way they can. And if that's through just giving out monies that's going to make these problems that we have in the economy worse, that's exactly what they're prepared to do. And it's all just political theater. And because the average Joe and Jane looks at that and says, well, yeah, George and Danielle, of course, they're going to give them free aid. This is the humanitarian thing to do. But they don't understand economics, and they don't realize that by helping them with their energy bill, you're just hurting them with their food bill. There's no free money here. So if you're going to reduce the cost by giving people money for X, you're going to increase the cost of Y. So on net balance, over the long run, it's just going to put them in a worse position. You think we would have learned this back in 2020 when we shut down the economy, we did all these lockdowns, these governments, these central planners, these authoritarians, and then they gave out these stimulus checks, and it caused what? Inflation. So the poor and middle class are worse off today than they were in 2019. But now what these politicians are trying to do is just double down on the same bad policies that created the problem in the first place in an effort to buy votes. You've got to come to the conclusion that these politicians are either stupid or evil, or maybe some of them are both. They're ethically bankrupt. And that's the group of characters we're dealing with right now when it comes to the politicians, not just in the United States, but all the bureaucrats with the EU and the global elite at the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the UN, etc. I think where this goes, there are no certainties, only probabilities, but my base case is there's going to be a political push to prevent Jerome Powell from continuing to raise rates. Now, I'm not talking about today or, in the next quarter, but going into 2023, they're going to try to prevent him or pressure him, let's say, to stop raising rates. This is assuming that we still have this inflation problem and we haven't had a deflationary bust between now and then with the stocks and the housing market, etc. But then I think what they're going to argue is, okay, stop raising rates, but the way we're going to tackle inflation is by giving stimmy checks, like we're seeing now, to help people afford the higher prices, and we're going to institute price controls, just like we had in the 1940s and just like we had in the 1970s. So we're going to stick it to those greedy capitalists who are increasing prices to crush the poor and middle class by capping the amount of price increases that they can actually implement. We're going to take their profits away from them. It's going to do a few things. Number one, it's going to be able to buy votes for, it's like Jim Grant always says. The politicians, they're the arsonist and they're the firefighter. So they're the ones that create the problem of inflation, but then they can come in on their white horse and say, hey, we're going to solve the problem with these price controls and giving you free money. And then, the people say, oh, well, that sounds good to me. Where do I sign up? And then they go ahead and vote for them. I think that's the angle here. But let me add to that, because I think there's also a Cantillon effect component of this. I don't know if you saw in the news recently, but this new gal up in Calgary, I think Smith is her name. She's the new premier up there. She just got rid of this agreement, this consulting agreement that they had with the World Economic Forum. And of course, she's being called a conspiracy theorist and all these things. Well, why on earth did the government, the Canadian government, had a consulting arrangement with the World Economic Forum? And you say, well, George, what was the consulting arrangement about? It was a health consulting agreement. So, and I don't know the details. I don't know if there was payment for the World Economic Forum. I would assume that there was, But this is how these things work. The politicians come out and say, hey, we're going to go ahead and spend all this money, but we're going to hire these consultants, these global elite. We're going to hire Klaus Schwab as a consultant. And then if there's a $13 billion program, Klaus ends up getting $1 billion of it, let's say. And then you say, well, what's the incentive for the politicians? Because Klaus has all of the politicians under his influence, and he's able to help them get elected. So you hear him come out and talk and brag, quite frankly, about how Trudeau and Putin was in his young political leader program as well, and Angela Merkel, and I think Macron was in there. And so he's saying, we got all these people that we influence in political positions of power right now. Okay, well, now those people are going to pay Klaus back for getting them elected in the first place with all these boondoggle programs. So this is the scam that's going on right now, and it's something that just most people aren't aware of. We already know how to manage an economy. The best way to do that is through prices. They always talk about increasing liquidity. Listen, we don't have a problem with liquidity as long as we allow a clearing price. So let the free market create the price of money, just like we did in the 1800s when we had free banking, which I'd like to remind everyone that the prices from 1800 to 1900, 100 years, went down by 50%. And this is with fractional reserve banking, but you just had the government out of it. We actually were able to determine what the prices of goods and services, including money, was supposed to be set by the marketplace. So all of these problems that the Fed is trying to fix, whether it's inflation, whether it's QT, QE, the Treasury's coming out, you can't get the heroin addict back to a place of normalcy, back to a sound footing, without a little bit of withdrawals. And that's what we need to go through as a society. But it's a very easy problem to fix. Just go back to free market capitalism. It goes back to who has the power? The people that create the green pieces of paper, or people who control the energy and commodities? You see, for several decades, the financial economy, in the West, has had all the power. But now I think what you're seeing is that these BRIC countries are starting to kind of scratch their head and say, why should we play by your rules just because you print green pieces of paper? That doesn't make any, or because you have the euro and that's a good currency. No, listen, we have all the stuff you need. We have the oil, we have the nat gas, we have the fertilizer. So why should we play by your rules? If we have the stuff that the whole world needs, we need to flip the table here. We need to flip the script. I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. From the standpoint of what are you going to do? You're going to take them off SWIFT? You're going to issue sanctions? That doesn't really do anything when they've just got all these other customers like India and China they can sell to. So I don't know what they can do other than just try to start World War III and create a nuclear war. And I mean, I hate to go down that path,
right,
but we see this type of rhetoric becoming more and more commonplace with the mainstream media and the politicians in the West. And I think that's a direction we could be headed. I think this could be what we're seeing play out in geopolitics right now. Because, let's look at we go back to that diesel shortage. You say, what can the United States do? So hopefully we can solve these problems, and we don't have to solve the problems by having a GFC 2.0, which would just reduce demand to a point where the demand supply was in equilibrium. But if can't, and because these issues are definitely structural, and they go back to the sanctions, they go back to the lockdowns as well, where we put all the refiners out of business. So now we're having to pay the piper here, right? But let's just assume that you go to a world that's not too far off, where the United States has no diesel. How do you get your food, right? How do you heat your house if you're in the Northeast? I mean, you sit there and people say, oh, that's kind of a conspiracy theory, you're fear-mongering. No, you're not. You got 25 days left. And that could possibly go down to zero. And if it goes down to zero, now all of a sudden you're literally living in a hellscape. It's like a zombie apocalypse. And we're right on the brink of that because we're having to find out the hard way that green pieces of paper don't matter as much as energy, commodities, food. When the yield curve inverts with a 2 and 10, so 2-year and 10-year, this is a very powerful indicator, but it doesn't give you a lot of timing, right? It's pretty much 18 to 24 months. You're most likely going to have a recession, 95% probability, call it, going back to the 1950s. But when the 3-month inverts with the 10-year, that's more of a timing tool. And usually that means that you're right in a recession or you're headed there very, very quickly. And if we go into a recession, I think there is a high probability that the Fed pivots, especially if there's a disorderly decline in asset prices. Not a soft landing, but a hard landing. And, you can get a 6-month T-bill right now for about 4.5%. And what I'm doing personally is I'm keeping my dry powder in that type of T-bill because long term I want to buy commodities. I think that we are in a super cycle that will last for probably 10, 15 years, but they're expensive. They've run a long way. So it's not like I'm a buyer at this price. I'm waiting for them to come down. It's very consistent with an economic decline and a decline in an empire, really, quite frankly, whether you want to look at that as just the United States or the West in general, where you have the rich getting even richer and richer and richer, and they're able to afford all the brand new Ferraris while the middle class gets completely decimated. So this is not a good sign for the economy. I mean, I would look at the shipping companies saying that, hey, we're going to have some tough times coming up. Or I would look at the Amazon just, giving horrible, horrible guidance. Or the Netflix. This is telling you what's happening to the poor middle class. And at the end of the day, that's what matters when we're trying to figure out what's going to happen to economic growth. And again, going back to the yield curve, I think regardless of what Ferrari's doing or Bentley or Rolls-Royce or anything, the bottom line is there's an extremely high probability that we will go into a very significant recession going into 2023. Call it the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. In which case the Fed will most likely pivot, and that's going to be great for investors because if you're really paying attention, that should provide you with some great opportunities to buy in things that I think you'll want to hold long term, such as those commodities, Bitcoin, gold miners, etc.